On May 23, 1430, the course of the 100 Years' War shifted once again. Joan of Arc, the young woman who had lifted the siege of Orleans and escorted Charles VII to his coronation at Reims, fell into enemy hands during a skirmish at Compiègne. The Burgundians who captured her understood immediately what they possessed, the most valuable prisoner in France. For months, Joan's fate hung in negotiation. The English government, desperate to reverse their military losses and undermine the legitimacy of Charles VII's coronation, moved quickly. By November 1430, they had paid the Burgundians 10,000 francs, a staggering sum equivalent to a king's ransom. Joan was transferred to Rouen, the administrative capital of English-occupied Normandy, and by December she found herself imprisoned in the castle of Bouvrouil under the direct control of the Earl of Warwick. The English strategy was clear. If they could prove Joan was a heretic, a woman guided not by divine voices but by demons, then Charles VII's coronation would be tainted. Every victory she had won would be recast as the work of witchcraft. The legitimacy of the entire French cause could be called into question. On January 3, 1431, an ecclesiastical court was convened. Leading the proceedings was Pierre Cochin, Bishop of Beauvais, a man who had long served as an advisor to the English occupation government. The charges against Joan were severe: wearing men's clothing in violation of biblical law, claiming to receive visions from saints, and refusing to submit to church authority. These were not merely religious infractions, they were accusations that carried the penalty of death by fire. What made Joan's situation particularly dangerous was the nature of her imprisonment. Under canon law, women accused of heresy were supposed to be held in church prisons and guarded by women, typically nuns. This was standard procedure, designed to protect female prisoners from abuse. Joan received no such protection. She remained in a military fortress, under English military control, guarded day and night by common soldiers who viewed her as an enemy combatant. The conditions were brutal. Joan was chained to a heavy wooden block, even when confined to a cell. Witnesses who later testified at her rehabilitation trial described iron shackles placed on her feet. Most disturbing was the constant presence of guards. 3 soldiers were stationed inside her cell at all times, with 2 more posted outside the door. Joan had no privacy, no moment of rest from the hostile watch of men who despised everything she represented. The guards subjected her to relentless harassment. Multiple witnesses later testified that the soldiers taunted her mercilessly and that she lived in constant fear. When Joan fell seriously ill during her imprisonment, suffering from fever and believing she might die, she begged to receive the sacrament and to be buried in consecrated ground. Her requests were denied. The Earl of Warwick intervened to prevent the worst abuses, not out of compassion, but because the English had paid an enormous sum for her and intended to extract full political value from her trial and execution. According to testimony given at the rehabilitation trial held 25 years later, Joan faced more than verbal abuse. Witnesses stated that she was threatened with physical assault, and one testimony indicated that a high-ranking English lord attempted to violate her. This context explains what the judges would later use against her. Joan's insistence on wearing men's clothing. Joan argued repeatedly that men's clothing tightly bound and laced provided protection that a woman's dress could not offer when surrounded by male guards. Her reasoning was practical and defensive. The judges, however, dismissed this explanation entirely. To them, a woman wearing men's clothing was an act of defiance against God's natural order, regardless of the circumstances that made it necessary for her survival. The formal interrogations began on February 21, 1431. Joan was brought into the chapel royal of the castle to face Bishop Cochin and a tribunal of 42 clerics. She agreed to swear an oath to answer truthfully, but made one condition clear: she would reveal nothing that might endanger King Charles VII. Over the next month, she would endure nearly a dozen interrogation sessions, each designed not to seek truth, but to trap her into admitting heresy. The clerics focused relentlessly on 3 issues: the nature of her visions, her refusal to submit absolutely to church authority, and her continued wearing of men's clothing. They crafted questions designed to condemn her regardless of how she answered. But Joan, despite her youth and lack of formal education, demonstrated a remarkable intelligence that impressed even some of her accusers. The most famous exchange of the trial came when the judges asked Joan whether she believed she was in a state of grace. It was a theological trap. Church doctrine held that no person could know with absolute certainty whether they possessed God's grace. If Joan answered yes, she would be contradicting established church teaching and claiming knowledge that belonged only to God. If she answered no, she would be admitting that her visions could not possibly be divine. Joan's response has echoed through history: "If I am not in a state of grace, I pray God will place me there. If I am, I pray God will keep me there." Even the hostile judges could find no fault with this answer. It was perfect theology, spoken by a 19-year-old peasant girl with no formal training. But cleverness alone could not save her. The initial 70 charges brought against Joan were eventually reduced to 12 articles of accusation. Some members of the tribunal began questioning the proceedings. One stepped down from the court, stating publicly that the testimony was being manipulated to entrap Joan rather than to seek truth. Another cleric challenged Cauchan's right to judge the case at all and was immediately imprisoned for his objection. The trial itself violated numerous principles of canon law. Joan was interrogated for weeks before being formally read the charges against her. She was given no legal counsel. The trial took place in Rouen rather than in Joan's home diocese of Domremy, a clear breach of procedure. Evidence examined by later scholars suggests that trial transcripts were falsified at crucial points to make Joan's statements appear more incriminating than they actually were. On May 23, 1431, exactly 1 year after her capture, Joan was brought before the tribunal and informed of the verdict. Theologians from the University of Paris had reviewed her case. Their judgment was unanimous and damning. Her claims to hear the voices of St. Catherine and St. Margaret were declared to be the work of demons. Her wearing of men's clothing was pronounced unnatural and wicked. Her refusal to submit unconditionally to church authority made her a heretic. If she would not recant, she would be handed over to secular authorities for execution by burning. The following day, Joan was taken to the cemetery of St. Win and placed beside a prepared stake. The sight broke her. Faced with immediate death, weakened by months of imprisonment and isolation, abandoned by the king she had crowned, Joan signed a form of abjuration. She recanted her claims and admitted she had deceived the people of France. Her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She was ordered to wear a woman's dress. She complied. But Joan's recantation lasted only days. When Bishop Cauchan and other judges visited her cell shortly after, they found her once again dressed in men's clothing. Joan stated that she had changed back of her own will, saying the voices had reproached her for denying the truth to save her life. However, witnesses at the later rehabilitation trial provided a different account. They testified that guards had deliberately stolen Joan's dress during the night, leaving her nothing to wear except the men's clothing, forcing her to put it on. Whatever the precise circumstances, the result was predetermined. Under canon law, a relapsed heretic could not be given a second chance. On May 29, the judges unanimously agreed that Joan must be handed over to secular authorities for execution. On the morning of May 30, 1431, Joan was allowed to receive the sacraments, a small mercy that technically violated the rules for condemned heretics. She was then led from her cell to the old marketplace in the heart of Rouen, where a large crowd had gathered. A tall plastered pillar had been erected in the center of the square. Joan was tied to it. As preparations were made, Joan asked to see a cross as she died. An English soldier, moved by her plea, fashioned a simple cross from 2 sticks and gave it to her. She kissed it and held it against her chest. Then a processional crucifix was brought from a nearby church and held before her eyes as the flames were lit. As the fire rose around her, witnesses reported hearing Joan cry out repeatedly. Her final word, shouted above the roar of the flames, was the name of Jesus. At 19 years of age, Joan of Arc died in the marketplace of Rouen. After her death, the executioners burned her remains twice more to ensure nothing was left that could become a relic. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine River. The English believed they had erased Joan of Arc from history. But 25 years later, a rehabilitation trial convened at the request of Joan's mother. The court heard testimony from 115 witnesses. The judges declared that the 1431 verdict was invalid, tainted by bias and riddled with procedural errors. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. The woman burned as a heretic became a patron saint of France.